discuss the ongoing conflict in Manipur. Situation in Manipur is more complex than a simple case of majority versus minority. At its core, the conflict is driven by ethnic, political, and historical factors rather than just division between larger and smaller communities. This web podcast is focused on understanding the complex conflict in Manipur, while dynamics in Manipur may involve different are more multifaceted than a simple majority versus minority narrative. I'll be your host for today. Let me begin by giving you a brief introduction about our guest speakers. Our first esteemed guest speaker for today is Lieutenant General Dr. Konsam Himalay Singh ji, who received military awards like Param Vishish Seva Medal, PVSM, along with other medals like UYSM, AVSM, YSM, for his distinguished services to the country. He is a former Lieutenant General of the Indian Army, and he is the first officer from Northeast India to reach the rank of Lieutenant General in the Indian Army, and the first military officer from Manipur to reach the ranks of Brigadier and Major General. He was the chairman of Manipur Public Service Commission and is currently a member of Consultative Committee of Manipur Government on Naga Peace Talks. He's also a visiting faculty at Manipur University and also an author. Welcome, sir. It is a privilege to have you here on this web podcast.
Thank you.
Our second esteemed guest speaker for today is Rami Niranjan Desai ji. Rami ji is an author, anthropologist, and a scholar of Northeast tribal issues and Indo-Pacific and current affairs. She regularly writes an English news channel. Welcome, Rami ji, and thanks for joining us today for this podcast. India Society International was established in UK in April 9 as a formidable voice for all related matters in the UK. FISI provides a forum to discuss various of the concerned topic. In line with this objective, we are hosting this web conflict unfolding in Manipur. I'll start this interesting discussion with first question to General Singh. General Singh, what role is post-independence decisions and geostrategic location of Manipur play in fueling ethnic tensions?
Thank you, Mr. Vinay, for having me here. Your question can be policies, the impact of that in this crisis. And the second part is you spoke about the geopolitics. So shall I go ahead with answering these two at the same time?
Sure, sir. Yeah.
Okay. First is the colonial policies. As you know, the contact with the colonizers with the Northeast India actually began sometime early 19th century, and 1826 the Treaty of Yandabu formalized the presence of Yandabu Treaty of Yandabu was between Burma and the East India Company, and it formalized the presence of colonizers, British colonizers in the Northeast India. That is the beginning. But what made the difference was that entire home kingdom was dismantled and more or less became British India, but they left out Manipur as a separate kingdom. And no other kingdom was there in the entire Northeast India, although there were many tribes and many communities in various very difficult terrain of Northeast India. So when they started slowly coming into the northeastern region, mostly due to their commercial interests like tea, oil, and timber, and such like that. Their interest took actually very deep roots thereafter on basically commercial, and that time that so-called uh, 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 great power game between the French in Burma and British in the northeastern part and the eastern part of our country. So in this, when they started intruding into the territories of a home kingdom and very loose other various areas dominated by various tribes. As you know, there are more than 180, ethnic groups even today, in Northeast India. So how do they try to manage such a diverse and such a very difficult situation as far as the ethnicity groups are concerned? So what they created, you must have heard rules about inner line regulation. What is commonly known as inner line regulation, otherwise Bengal Frontier Regulations of 1873, which prohibited, movement of tribes into the plains and plain people to the, hills and jungles. This had, I don't want to go into the details of why this was made, because originally it was meant to actually avoid the raids by the tribes towards British commercial interests. But then they also made it in such a manner that what they call as white tribes, regulation, the Bengal front. Slowly, these were the methods administration is like excluded areas. So this kind of from the mainland uh, actually spread uh, the found a very and also it was perpetuated due to the reasons for areas. So as a rebound, um, uh, action by the, you know, prevented from conversion into larger Sanatan beliefs. So this, as I partially excluded, and the Christian, the method of Christian in Manipur is that, and after the battle was defeated, the British officers hit 1895, around that time. So it continued in some form or the other. That perhaps was because for the fear of very few people knew what notice tribes, and it's easier to actually just transfer the same thing in some other name into the constitution. So you would be surprised that even Arunachal, the present day Arunachal General Affairs, that was the level of our polity at that time. So this is just a brief background. The second to my mind today, I think the the Pacific, even though very keen interest in Myanmar mentioned, but we are Indo-Pacific. That means into the Pacific. Now the Great Game East actually is going to unfold. How does it impact Manipur? Is that you will find that over the last 3-4 years, whatever is being played out and its lines and whatever domination is achieved, that has to be countered by the Bengal. That is why, in fact, a lot of people talk about the involvement here. So, to sum it up in a very briefly, because we have the issue in particular becomes a game going to play it around between the supporters and the West and one side and this game. Here, I will call it that Indo-Myanmar border and where things are going to unfold. I think this.
Thank you, sir. So, as you mentioned that there was a hill and valley divide created, and mostly what I understand based on my secondary research is the Naka and Kuki, they are concentrated more at the hilly areas, and Mighty, they are concentrated more at the valley, right? Mighty, Naga, and shape this conflict in Manipur and how political and economic demands in the region.
I'm glad that I'm on this platform with podcast or talking actually about Manipur because as well as people speaking on the impact or the effect that it may have me to be here is purely because Mother HG invited me, and your platform is, so very responsible, and you have a panelist like General Himalay Singh. Now, having said that, as General Singh has already given a background on what caused all of these divides, let me just add 1 or 2 points to it. The problem is, the reason that we find this Manipur conflict so fascinating, other conflicts in the Northeast so fascinating, suddenly we find Northeast so fascinating when we actually haven't cared about it for the last 70 years, is because simply we don't understand our own civilizational diversity. We have zero idea on how we should look at tribal communities. We have zero idea on our ancient civilizational connectivity. And I say this from both ends, the outsider and the insider perspective. The identities have become so cemented that it's almost segregated. What was an ancient civilizational continuity has been segregated by identities. Now it's a tribal versus non-tribal, which not only impacts tribal communities within, but also impacts their relationships with other communities. Before these binaries were brought in and these lenses were brought in, the great Indian civilization, the great Hindu civilization, didn't have a segregation between who's a tribal, who's not a tribal. Words like tribal, words like animism, these are all products of the English language. We actually don't have equivalents of that in our own indigenous languages. Even actually the word indigenous, when you're using it again as a binary as to who is central to that land and who isn't. Again, is an anthropological outsider's lens. So when the British came in, for them they had to look at India and populations in India as indigenous, non-indigenous, tribal, non-tribal, and of course, tribal. The minute you say tribal, it also comes in succession with words like barbaric, savage, animists. These are all derogatory terms. They have a pejorative meaning, and the reason it is used is because people who are using these words want justification to civilize. Again, a word that, when we use the word civilization, we are only using it in the context of comparison with what civilization means to the West. Now, having said that, these are the binaries that we see having created fault lines that we see the results of today. What have we seen in Manipur? We've seen this, again, the same fault lines, the same binaries being played out of tribal versus non-tribal. Now, who is to say who's a tribal? Who is to say who's not a tribal? Because if we really go by, if we were to take historical context of it, for us, really there's no such thing as tribal or non-tribal. There is Janjati, which just means, a population of variety, or Vanvasi, somebody who lives in the forest, but certainly not tribal. Tribal means cultish. Tribal means a tribe, So not necessarily that. When you look at Manipur, and it's not just a question about Manipur, but there are many other pockets of tribal communities across India. You realize that the kind of segregation that we have put these communities through, in order to bring, in order to say that, they require different development initiatives because they are at a nascent stage of civilization. I am not saying this on my own. This is what the British wrote in their papers. This is what, when the colonialists and the anthropologists went to the Northeast, wrote in their books and their reports that these populations are so remote that they are at a nascent stage of nationhood. Therefore, they should be kept aside because they're not ready to join the nation as they are. There were many nationalist educators, sociologists, politicians who fought against this. And let me say, we have gotten into this habit of tracing everything back to the British, everything back to the West, but we didn't do anything to change these narratives post-independence as well. We all know very well that Jawaharlal Nehru's tribal affairs advisor was a former missionary, Verrier Elvin, who propagated the fact that there should be segregation between these communities, whereas other nationalist leaders said, no, the minute you segregate these communities, the level of development between them and the rest of the country will be unequal, leading to all sorts of disparities. But we never changed that. Now, what's happened in Manipur is exactly, the seeds that we have sown and not bothered to address. We've seen binaries of, tribal, non-tribal play out. We've seen binaries of majority, minority play out. But if we were to even forget the British and go by the standards of what all our committee reports on tribal communities, Government of India reports say, I would beg to differ, and I would actually argue that majority of tribal communities who enjoy tribal status do not fall into the stipulations of what a tribal should be. If you look at local committee report says, and everybody knows this by now. A year ago, let me tell you, not many people would have known what the local committee report was. But luckily through, these unfortunate times, people have become more aware than they were before. It says that there has to be geographical isolation for a community. There are different parameters of what a tribal should be. There has to be geographical isolation. There has to be shyness of contact with other people. There has to be, there are many other such stipulations. Most tribal communities who enjoy these benefits are nothing of that sort. On the contrary, there has been massive conversion bringing them into mainstream religious practices. Now, you can argue this either way. It doesn't matter personally to me if you're enjoying a status or you're not. But the fact of the matter is, if you're enjoying a status, you do not have the right to oppose anybody else demanding that status. The only authorities that really have a right to decide on whether you should get a tribal status or not is the government of India, and there are very tough processes that are in place to ascertain your tribal status. Number two, your binary of majority and minority. If this is such a big problem, and I have seen, it started from Manipur of, the majority community, wherein it was the Metis. And if you look at the population, you can hardly call this sort of a difference, majority. But that narrative moved then to applying it to the rest of the country. So we've seen a lot of people with separatist tendencies, with a unipolar sort of lens, saying that, we are not getting what we want a separate administration, but we're not getting that because of the majority BJP voting population, majority Hindu population, which the Metis also fall into. So, it's very sad. What we've seen is this binary not limit itself to the state of Manipur, but extend itself to the rest of the country, which makes it a very negative sentiment for anybody to promote or propagate, considering that for decades on, the same people who are using the majority minority binary are the people who have benefited from the benefits that you get from the rest of the country to you, who is a self-confessed minority. So I think these binaries are very separatist in nature. These binaries come from a dubious background, and we've seen it play out in Manipur. Lastly, I'd like to say that we've come a long way in this conflict, and we've seen a lot of narratives develop. We've seen better understanding of what our communities are, what are the challenges that they face, and how these fault lines can be manipulated. The conflict will stop. I have always said this. There is no doubt that this conflict, will sort of taper down. But these fault lines are going to exist. And I think it would be very foolhardy for us to, say, Manipur's calmed down, our job is done. Because these are fault lines, these are examples of what we are going to face in the future. You asked a very pertinent question to General Himalay Singh about the geopolitical nature of this conflict. Considering that we are surrounded by countries that are imploding, so as to say, have their own ethnic conflicts going on, and have certain external interests that may not be necessarily fueling it, but are sustaining it. This is only a little flicker of what can happen across the region of Northeast India. So I think we have a long way to go. There have been some great initiatives that I'm sure we'll talk about shortly, that have been taken by the government of India recently. But this is not the end. I think there is a lot more work that we have to do.
Janal Singh, since you talked about, and Ramiji also talked about that there's a binary of majority and minority, and there is a hill valley division created, right? Do you think there is an economic disparity also between these two, like hilly areas and the valley? And if yes, then how does it contribute to the current conflict?
Thank you. Before I come to that, can I just say a word about the binaries?
Sure, yeah, please.
To begin with, actually, it had nothing to do with tribal, non-tribal. When I say tribal, the scheduled tribe and non-scheduled tribes. Why I'm saying is that let's say the Nagas, they form the majority of the tribal groups, and they were not actually involved in this crisis at all. That is the first issue. The point, and another is that there is no, in some Western media, in fact, New York Times of 6th of May, I think, 2023, talked about Hindu and, Hindu majority, um, creating such kind of assault against the Christian minority. Let me tell you, actually, Hindus are the minority in Manipur, given the fact that many original Meitei who are otherwise Western white culture, they have shifted to Christianity. So actually, Hindus are actually a minority. And when you say valley again, hill valley again, valley comprises about the Muslims and all other non this thing, and also a significant close to about 6%, 6 to 8% of the valley population itself is all the Nagas and other tribes as well. So we should not forget that the valley is a microcosm of multi-ethnic space there. And so that is about a binary. It was certainly not about. Somebody talked about majority against the minority, and I have told you that I'll give you some figures. Actually, if you see as per the police, I'm going by the police records. As per that, more number of majority have actually been killed. Many people talk about ethnic cleansing. I don't know who is cleansing whom. Definitely, it's not ethnic cleansing. It's just ethnic violence. Of course, supported by various agendas and narratives that Rami Desai mentioned about. So that is about the binaries. Coming to the economic disparity, I'll say yes. In fact, my PhD thesis was on the ethnic conflict in Manipur. That was way back in 2016 when I retired. That is close to about 8, 9 years back. So it is a very interesting find. If you believe the statistical data of the government expenditure, in terms of expenditure, there was no disparity. But on ground, there is. Like, I'll give you an example that very recently, the government of Manipur did put out. In fact, I was requesting the authorities that you please put out all this. The expenditure has been done, but on ground there are no. Why it is though? Because the ecosystem is such that because of whatever you call insurgency or conflict situation or instability, whatever things are not getting translated onto the ground. Not only now, for many decades. So there is a lack of such kind of a development there in the hills, as well as in the far-flung areas in the valleys also have suffered from this. But yes, there is no denying that a lot there is economic this. You'll find many well-to-do, most of the well-to-do people have from the hills and our tribal brothers. They've all shifted into the Imphal Valley, not only Valley, in other metros as well. So to sum it up, it was about lack of, I'll say, governance or people closing their eyes on all these issues. There is a economic disparity on ground, I'll say. But when you look at the budgetary allocations, I found that it was reasonable, except for some departments. So you can draw your own conclusions. It's the execution of those which are lacking. And why? I directly say this through the ecosystem that is going around there. So economic disparity exists. I'll give you another example. During my research, I based my this thing on 2011 census. That statistical data. There were over 200 villages with less than 100 population. 100 population. So on ground, there were about 50 villages with nobody around. Nobody around. So when you say that, okay, the road does not go to this particular village. Actually, the village, many of them don't exist. If they exist, there are 50 or 60 there's not houses, but number of villages there. So when whereas in the valley areas, the villages, their population is some 6,000, 7,000, 10,000, like that. So maybe because of the over dependence on the central assistance, there is, and then as you know, 90% of the funding is by the center. So therefore, there is an issue about the disparity as far as development is concerned, and this is a cause of concern.
Okay. And over to you, Ramiji. I mean, Himalayji touched upon that there is a negative narrative in terms of the majority is actually not majority. The Hindus are minority there, and then there is a narrative about ethnicity, right? So, what do you think that this tension between these communities, and how has the media contributed in shaping the public perception? What are your thoughts here?
General Himalay Singh is absolutely right. These negative narratives of question, they were that already existed, being manipulated. Nobody was really interested in more humanitarian stories, so that sensitivity between the rest. Instead, it was being used as a tool to divide the country further. Now, of course, we can blame the media as much as we want to, but organizations on ground representing these communities also went to international platforms and gave representation. So they are to blame as much as anybody else. This whole when this whole religious binary was spun about Christians versus Hindus, and General Himalay Singh is absolutely right. You'd probably find the Hindus in a minority. Whether they've converted to Christianity. Mehtis also have a certain amount of Muslim population. A lot have reverted back to practices of Sanamaism. Whatever it may be, the fact was it was never a religious conflict. And to see it in such a rudimentary manner means that there was malice in your heart. But organizations didn't get up to correct it because it was supporting what they wanted, which was to somehow deepen this conflict so that it can become a tool to achieve what their agenda was. Now, if it was an economic problem, if it was a developmental problem, which it very well might be, then this is not the way to achieve better economic stability or development, or to ask the government of India to pay more attention to to whatever they thought was lacking. This was certainly not the right way. Now, if it was an economic development, the whole agenda should have been, look, this is what is lacking. This is the kind of money I think is not going to the right places. I think action should be taken towards, let's say, if it was the Hill Councils, action should be taken amongst in the Hill Council to see, if there's rampant corruption, why there is an equitable distribution. I mean, I'm not saying that these are absolute issues, but I'm saying that if this was the issue that you weren't getting development, then for the betterment of your community, that is what should have been tackled. Instead, every other binary was brought, not just deepening the conflict and the fault lines between communities, but also extending it to beyond the borders of Manipur. Now, when I talk about the tribal, non-tribal binary, I think this becomes a very, very important point for us to understand. This may not have been the true crux of the conflict, but it was used. We also very quickly realized that it did not extend to within our borders, that there were transnational ethnic ties, there were larger agendas. You may want to believe it, you may not want to believe it, because obviously there are many, in the Western media, in the left media within our country as well, that are very happy to negate anything that doesn't suit their narrative. But let me bring your attention to what Sheikh Hasina said. just before her ouster. And there is no doubt now that it was a US-backed regime change. Now that we know that $21 million or some ridiculous amount of money was paid by US aid. We also knew before that, I myself had written many articles on it, that there is going to be a regime change because the kind of interference of the US embassy in Dhaka in the election process itself was evident that they were very invested in this. And just before Sheikh Hasina's ouster, she made the famous or the infamous statement, as you know, we all know, about a larger Christian state. She didn't mention in that statement, she didn't mention India. She said Bangladesh, Myanmar, and another country contiguous to these two countries, which obviously tells that it was India. So, there have been people who've said, oh, well, she says whatever she wants to say. No, I'm sorry, a premier of a country saying something like this, and then for us to have enough evidence to say that she had some weight to what the statement that she made, tells us of the larger agendas and the larger, larger vested interests fueling the conflict. Now, these are at the back end. A lot of us who are just observing this conflict and observing the developments in the Northeast may not know about the back-end interferences and the turmoil that will fuel this conflict, for which you would have to, on a day-to-day basis, study developments in our neighborhood. You look at Myanmar, you have ethnic conflict that has been, since the coup, has been on a literal boil, which has had effects on us, which is not just illegal immigration, but has also been weapons being smuggled and trafficked across the borders, has also been money coming in, there have also been transnational ethnic ties, there's been drug trafficking, all of this played a role, all of this came to light. But what did the media do? The media gave it the kind of, didn't give this back end, what was happening in the back end, any sort of promotion. But, it didn't bring the truth out to the public. But what did it do? It spun the negative narrative as it wanted to and when it wanted to, looking at this conflict in the most rudimentary, the most, I would actually go to say, in the most anti-national way that you could. And you can't blame the Western media. The Western media also takes its P's and Q's from, Indian media. We had people writing about this, people who hated this dispensation, who hate the government in power, using the Manipur conflict as a way to substantiate that India has a religious minority majority issue going on, even in some of its most remote states. The media, of course, continued doing this. I think the organizations that gave representations on international platforms gave them ample material to do so. I think the left media in this country also did so, because anything that is seen from a religious lens gets a lot of viewership. I think the media completely ignored not just the original causes of the conflict, but the causes that continued inflaming the conflict, for the amount of time that it has. The media did not bother doing its research and looking at the historical and legacied issues of these conflicts, nor did it pay any attention in really doing a positive job, wherein the point of view of a common citizen should have been in understanding the sensitivities on the ground and the suffering of the people. I think this was completely missed out, and plain and simple reason that it is missed out is because we've gotten used to this excitement. If today I say a couple of really radical things right now against one community or another in Manipur, you will get more viewership than if I try to be, more logical or rational or technical about it. Therefore, I said this right at the outset, because this is also now, podcasting is possibly the most popular mode of media, building media narratives, building narratives across, not necessarily mainstream news channels any longer. And that's why I said at the outset that, I have been declining a lot of invitations on debates of this, because I think it's hugely irresponsible for even people like me who comment to go on shows where I know the person who is interviewing or the platform that I've been given is itself irresponsible. So I think, yes, I think we've learned a lot about how the media can change the course of a conflict in this country.
I see there are a lot of voices being raised on autonomy and self-determination by different communities. And to you, General Singh, do you think that is autonomy based on ethnicity a solution? How ethnic communities should agree for judicious distribution of resources, particularly land resources and development benefits?
Yeah, very incisive question. Just a little background on that trans-border thing, what Rami was talking about. I have said in multiple platforms that the drug money across the border in this part of the country is annual turnover is close to anything between 40 to 50,000 crore rupees, and I suspect that it could be much more. With that kind of money and availability of weapons, I'll give you an example about the availability of weapon. In the last, between 2010 and 2018, in fact, security forces recovered 6,000 illegal weapons, all types, 6,000. That is well before the ethnic crisis. So if 6,000 could be recovered, you can imagine the number of weapons floating around, which many people actually ignore to close their eyes. So there is a trans-border issue there of the drugs and illegal migration and all that. That had to be in the name of free movement regime. So nobody is against free movement of people across the border. All that people are saying is that please identify yourself, come, and then go back also. That's the only thing that actually, but somehow it didn't get executed on ground. And to your question about autonomy, I'll give a little. During the states reorganization in India, mostly it was on language based kind of a rough uh, parameters. In the Northeast, when at the time of independence, there were only two entities, that is Assam and Manipur, Tripura, three, sorry. Because Tripura and Manipur were kingdoms who signed a merger agreement at the time of independence. And Assam, because it had become a British British, territory, British India territory. So, but just see the ethnicities. Ethnicities force further breakdown to Naga Hills became Nagaland, and Mizo Hills, Lusai Hills became Mizoram, and Khasi Hills, Jaintia, and Garo. Mind you, the origin of Garos are totally different from the origin of Khasis. So all these were on ethnic lines, roughly on ethnic lines, forgetting the fact that we have over 180 ethnic groups. And how many autonomy are you going to? Yes, I am for developmental projects for certain amount of autonomy in order to bring about development, not to inject subnationalism, not to inject secessionist ideas. So, so what kind of a manner, whatever we have, early, we have now 7 states and 8 including Sikkim, and the various ethnic groups that are now struggling for some kind of autonomy as huge. Are you going to base your separation due to on ethnic grounds? I am not very sure that it will succeed, or will it bring more secessionist ideas and more identity constructs? Just as, I mean, I don't want to go into the identity constructs. Today, grouping, regrouping, breaking up under the barrel of the gun, all this have been going on, and people knew it. If I could, as a normal citizen, observe it, I have no compunction in saying that people, those who matter, those who decide the policy, they would have known it for years, for decades. So if you are going to base any administration on ethnic lines, communal lines, then I think you're looking for trouble. Not only for internal issues, but external, where externally linked, linked in terms of many people. Like we have Lusai Chin, we can go back how many years? Let's say 400 years ago we were same, or we were this. Even the Hindu Meiteis have, they are called Kates in Burma. They have. So how long are you going to look at ethnicity as that is something. Firstly, I don't personally agree on this theory of creating autonomy on ethnic lines, and how long are you going to, how far are you going to go on to this? In view of this peculiar socioeconomic and historical and also security paradigm that is obtaining in this. So I personally don't feel that that will be the solution. But as I said earlier, some kind of a devolution of power for development purpose, that has to be, that could be considered. Thank you.
As you said, sir, that ethnicity cannot be the only way for the autonomy, right? So, Ramiji, what do you think that what are the some potential pathways to peace in Manipur that go beyond addressing this majority versus minorities or beyond the binaries which you discussed about earlier, right? What do you suggest that what are the potential pathways to peace?
Well, I think largely I agree with what General Singh has said. How far can you take autonomy? Why is autonomy so much more important than actually aiming at larger integration? Our identity is as citizens, we are Indians, and I think that should play priority in whatever we say, whatever we demand for, because that is what gives you the kind of respect it gives you across the world. If I was to go and say, and I'm a Sufi from a small village in Besma, and say that, oh, I'm from West, who's going to know me? People are going to know me because I'm an Indian. So I think, that is the sentiment that we lose when we keep pushing for further autonomy, pushing for further segregation. Also, that gives an impetus for other vested interests to manipulate that sentiment of segregation. Also, what does it do to your future generations? What sort of an identity does it leave them with? As a country, we are growing towards more, for the lack of better words, we are for more familiarity amongst each other. I remember traveling to the Northeast 20 years ago, and people were shocked to see me in the Northeast, as were people shocked to see me go to the Northeast. Today, it's become the most fashionable spot to go. Everybody wants to take a trip there. You want to try the cuisine there. One of the biggest lanes in Delhi, the most popular lanes in Delhi, is a lane full of Northeastern cuisine. People from the Northeast have always come to, places like Delhi or Bangalore to study. That is what we should be aiming at. Now, looking at what can be done for a peaceful path ahead. Like I said, I am of the firm belief that there are no quick answers to this. We can solve the conflict today. And I think some really good moves have been taken wherein there's been a deadline that's been set for returning weapons that had been stolen, surrendering weapons. Negotiations are on. I think we have a firm grip on security in Manipur at this moment. There have been directives that highways should be opened with immediate effect. That this sort of artificial buffer zone that had been made should be dissipated as soon as possible. But we have to look at this short term and long term. I think short term, what can be done, and I've always said this, that communities on ground have a great role to play. These are situations where really greatness can be found, I think one of the great moves would be to be able to bring some of the internally displaced people back to their homes and for respective communities to ensure their protection. And I've been to both, I've been to camps of the Metis and I've been to camps of the Cookies, Suffering makes people equal. There is nobody who's suffering more. The Cookie children aren't suffering more than the Methi children and vice versa. And that's an awful, awful situation to be in. They've lost everything. And when I went to these camps, of course, people who were very poor, people who came from abject poverty, but there were also people who probably had done well for themselves, because I saw that they put everything in their cars, and these were nice cars, and run to refugee camps. This has psychological impacts as well. So I think the first thing would to have these gestures of humanity, wherein you can bring these people out of their camps, take them back to their homes if there's anything left of their homes, or give them temporary homes in the places of their origin, and for communities who live around them to ensure their protection and to take some sort of responsibility. I think any sort of buffer zone, and I remember there was like this artificial buffer zone between the hills and the valleys. I think absolutely one has to get rid of it.